Hey everybody, Doug here with Doug Johnson Productions in Orem, Utah, and today we're going to talk about the various cameras that I use in live video production. I've got quite a range of them here, and this isn't everything that I use. There's occasionally other ones that come up, but this is the cameras that I use the majority of the time. So starting from your right to my left, this is the Blackmagic Design Ursa Mini 4K. This is the Canon mount version of it. Sony PXW-Z150. It's a 4K Sony, about a year old model. Then we get to the Blackmagic Design Micro Studio camera. And then a little tiny, I'm not even sure of the brand, Chinese security camera. I selected because it does have HD SDI, and picture quality is pretty good for what it is. Come back here. This is an older model. I only use these as backup, but it's the HVR V1U from Sony. Here we have the Sony SRG 300 SE. Pan tilt zoom. I have a video on that. And then lastly over here it's HXR MC2500, also from Sony. So getting a little bit about why I use each one, what I think of each one. We'll start over here with the Ursa Mini. Now I'm finding that this actually doesn't make a very good live production camera. It has some issues that make it difficult to use in a live situation. One of the primary concerns I have with it is the amount of latency in the video coming out the SDI. It's delayed by 4 or 5 frames, somewhere in there. I've never checked it, but it is enough to be noticeable compared to the other cameras that I'm using. And so if I'm doing something that it's going to be obvious that the camera's out of sync, I more or less can't use that one in a live situation. If you had an entire setup that involved only Ursa Minis and they're all delayed by the same amount, that might be okay. But in a situation, for example, where you're sending your program feed out to a projector that's visible by the audience of a particular event, between the delay on the camera, any delay added by the switching equipment, and then the delay added by the projector, you're talking about a picture that's quite out of sync with what's actually going on. And so, because of the latency, among other issues, I rarely pull this camera out for live production situations. I only get it out when I absolutely need interchangeable lens camera. Like for example, if I need a really long distance shot, I'll take this camera along with a 150 to 600 millimeter lens, pop that on there, and get me the long shot that I'm looking for. However, it's certainly not ideal. I know Blackmagic tries to sell this as a great studio camera. My experience says otherwise. It is convenient to have the SDI input on it and for that camera to know how to decode the control information that's coming from the Blackmagic switcher. So for example, you can set the exposure, you can even set things like iris, focus remotely from the Blackmagic software. And that is nice, but just too many other downsides. The other downside is the lack of an ND filter. So if you're shooting under varying lighting conditions, this camera can be pretty frustrating to use. It only has 3 ISOs to choose from: 200, 400, 800. 800 is basically unusable. So you're left with 200, 400, which means if you're shooting indoors, you're always shooting with a wide open iris, which is not necessarily always ideal. I mean, you could have potential focus issues. And when shooting outdoors, you have to use ND. Otherwise, the picture is blown out. There's also some other issues there. And some of them could be overcome by adding a LUT, but for example, there's no knee control, and so bright highlights just are automatically blown out instead of being under control. Just some other things like that. So it's not what I would call an ideal studio camera. I do like it for filmmaking type projects. It's a great camera for that, but in terms of live use, it's not my first choice. It's usually actually my last. And so next we have the Sony PXW-Z150. This is actually my workhorse camera. I've currently got 3 of these, and I do plan to add more at some point. This is a 4K camera, so it can produce a very high resolution image. If I happen to be hired for a 4K production where they require 4K, this camera will do it. There are some trade-offs that I have to make, mostly because Blackmagic Design does not have a 4K camera converter. The other issue is Sony has not formally adopted the 6 gig SDI standard, so when it's operating in 4K mode, the SDI connector either doesn't output anything at all or outputs high def. And so the nice thing is I can shoot 4K internally and then send HD out the SDI port for live switching. So if I could actually do editing in post with a 4K recording from the camera, ISO recording, that would work. But the main reason, a couple main reasons I selected this camera are, first of all, it's got a 1-inch sensor on it, so relatively huge for a camcorder style camera, bigger than the 2/3 inch or 1/3 inch that you find used in ENG style video production. That allows a lot of light to be captured, so this camera is phenomenal in low light situations. I really like that. And if I need to, I can get a little bit of a shallow depth of field on there, much more shallow than you would get in, say, a 2/3 inch camera. Obviously, it does not have an interchangeable lens, but in this case, that's actually a benefit because it has, well, it's 12x optical, so 12:1 zoom, but this one has what Sony calls clear image zoom, which allows you to double that focal length in HD, or 1.5 times in 4K. And it's doing a digital interpolation on the picture, but I found that the picture quality is good enough that you can't actually tell that it's being digitally zoomed at all. It's more than just a simple zoom. It's doing quite a bit more than that. This camera produces a fantastic image. I do wish that it had a little bit more control over some of the imaging parameters, though it does have a lot. It does have a knee control. It does have some color correction features built into it. There's some other things it has. One thing that this one does not have that my older V1Us had was a skin softening feature, which is really useful. It's really nice to have. And this does not offer that. Some of Sony's higher end models do, but that's been omitted from this particular model. Sony has an extremely similar camera. Well, two of them. Well, actually, there's an HX100 that's just an HD only version of this. The main downside to that for live production is it only has HDMI out. It doesn't have SDI, and it's limited in some of the frame rates and whatnot that it will output out the HDMI port. So I had one of those things. I ultimately sold it because additional flexibility on this. But I've been extremely happy with this camera. There's another somewhat similar model that Sony offers, the PXW-Z150. It's a lot smaller. It's much more of a handheld compact camera, but it also has a 1-inch sensor. It's not identical, but it's really close. It's got a 1-inch sensor. It does have an upgradable 4K option. The menu's more or less identical. I don't own any of those yet, but if I do need to add more cameras that are similar to this, I will probably actually use those as standby cameras or additional cameras, with the Z150 still being my primary camera. So all in all, though, I have really liked this camera, not without a few quirks, and at some point I will do a full review on it. I'm not going to do sample footage, though. There's plenty of sample footage out there on YouTube. Suffice it to say, it does produce a stunning image. It's extremely good. All right, moving on to the Blackmagic Design Micro Studio camera. I'm just going to come right out and say it. I don't like this camera very much. Its low light sensitivity is absolutely awful. The lens selection on Micro Four Thirds is just not there when it comes to video. I know there's ways to adapt to B4 and use B4 lenses, but by the time, well, first of all, it's having to crop the image in order to do that, so you're losing resolution right out of the gate. But also, if you're buying B4 lenses, for the most part, you're not talking about low-budget video production any longer. You're talking about big-budget stuff. And if you're doing big budget, you probably wouldn't be buying any of this stuff. So it's an entirely different class whatsoever. Blackmagic recommends a few different lenses so that you have control over zoom and focus remotely. I found that those lenses are basically all garbage, and so I have not really been able to use this camera for anything real. I occasionally use it as a wide dump shot, but it has not been that useful. In addition to that, the first one I got had a bad power switch on it, and so brand new, I had to actually have it replaced. Blackmagic was good about it, but again, you don't expect that a brand new product straight out of the factory packaging has a problem. But battery life on it is basically atrocious, so you are more or less required to run it off of AC power. Image quality, if with a good lens, could be good, but I'm just finding that there aren't very many good lens options for that camera. So at this point, I can't recommend it. And for the same reason, I've steered clear of Blackmagic's full-size studio cameras. I was hoping that they would maybe do something in a new version of it to address some of the problems, but they just announced the replacement earlier this week, and they didn't change anything except for removing the battery. So I don't expect that we're going to see a better product from Blackmagic anytime soon. Bottom line, in the right amount of light, with a good lens, it could be a good camera, but in practical terms, the camera has almost been useless for me. So I'm wishing that I had taken that money and invested in one of the Sony X70s instead at this point. So, all right, this guy, a little tiny security camera. This only does a 1080p 30 image, which is kind of odd because most of the time when you're talking about 30 frames per second, you're actually really dealing with 2997. This doesn't do 2997, it does 30. And so anytime I'm using this, I have to run it through one of my decimator converters in order to convert it to whatever frame rate I'm actually shooting, whether that be 5994 or 2997. But the image quality on it is actually surprisingly good, and it does have separate focus and zoom controls on it. As kind of a camera you can stick and hide somewhere on a stage or something like that, it actually works pretty well. The one downside is it has a very much non-standard mount on it, so ultimately what you're going to be doing is using clamps or something in order to, or even gaffer's tape in order to mount it somewhere, because the factory mount is basically worthless. But it is nice that it has HD SDI on the output, so you don't have to convert analog or HDMI to an SDI signal. So I'll have links for that in the description down below. So if that's something you're interested in, you can pick one of those up. Just keep in mind that you will have to do a frame rate conversion if you use that camera. Next, I've got the Sony SRG300 SE. I've done a full separate video about this camera, but it's pan tilt zoom, and I use some proprietary software that I wrote in order to remotely control it. And I also got some proprietary cables that I made in order to power this over power over Ethernet. So when I set up this camera, I run one Ethernet, it provides power and data for controlling the camera, and then SDI for the video. So been very handy. This camera is surprising in a lot of ways. First of all, it has a 30 times optical zoom. The amount of light you get when you zoom in at 30 times drops considerably, so you're really punching up the gain in order to make a bright enough image unless you're outdoors or in a very well-lit location. But the image quality on it is surprisingly good for being as small and relatively affordable as it is. I was happy enough with this that I bought a second one, and I've got two of these now, and correspondingly modified my software so I can control both of them with one Xbox controller. Anyway, I've been very happy with this camera. To step up to 4K with pan tilt zoom, you're quadrupling the price of this one, and Sony just barely announced the 4K PTZ camera for the first time earlier this week. It's nearly $12,000. So if I'm shooting a 4K production, I'm either not using these or having to upscale, one of the two. And upscaling comes with its own challenges. You know, you get the latency from the upscaling. So, but for the most part, I've been very happy with this camera. And not only does it have 30 times optical zoom, the digital zoom on it is actually pretty usable. So I've been able to get things from a very long distance with that camera, as long as the camera is positioned on a sturdy tripod so it's not shaking people moving around or whatnot. All right, next, the Sony HXR V1U. I've got three of these. These are older cameras, as I mentioned, and I don't pull these out unless I need to shoot more than 6, 7, 8 cameras. The main issue is image quality. It's just not as good on this one as it is on the newer ones. You'd expect that. You know, this camera came out 2008. It's now 2017, so it's 9 years old at this point. The one nice thing about this is it has a true optical zoom of 20 times, and then it has a extender on it which is able to give you additional zoom range electronically. It's not really the sensor is higher resolution than what the video signal is, and so you're just able to take advantage more information on the sensor. These like I say, these images are a little bit soft compared to some of the more modern cameras, but it works fairly well. And if I need to throw one of these into a production, it's really not that big of a deal. Like all Sonys, it has absolutely tremendous battery life. This was my workhorse camera for quite a few years until I decided to break the bank and invest in the Z150s. So again, I don't use these much anymore, but they did work for me very well for a long time. And you can pick them up for cheap. I actually bought a unit on eBay a little over a year ago. I got one for $375 and I got another for $550. So anyway, you can get a bargain on them, and they are good enough to use. It's just not as good as some of these others. All right, that brings us to the last one, the Sony HXR MC2500. This one, I'm not gonna lie, it's not a great camera. The image quality actually is pretty good for what it is, but it is so stripped down on features that it's not the sort of thing that you would normally want to use in a live production environment. And the main reason I got this is for its shoulder mount form factor. If someone's going to be roaming around with a camera, you want one that you can put on the shoulder. Holding up, say, one of these in front of you is hard to do for very long. I shot a music video a little while ago with one of these, and 45 minutes in the video, I was shaking. It's just a little too much weight to hold in your arm for very long, and so if somebody's going to be roving around, when you want to have a camera that's moving around, you really do need something that's shoulder mount. You put all the weight on the shoulder instead of somebody's arm, and it changes the whole equation. The image quality actually is pretty good. This does do full HD, 1920 by 1080, up to 60 frames per second. Zoom, it's 12x optical and then 24 times using Sony's clear image zoom. So it's okay. Not amazing, but it's fine. The main complaint I have with this camera, well, a couple of them. One, it's only got HDMI output, so I have to convert the HDMI to SDI, or use the camera converter's HDMI input, one of the two. And also the controls. Everything on this camera is controlled by this one ring. So if you're talking about setting your iris, you're doing focus, you can do zoom on there, but it does have a zoom rocker, so you probably never do that. But like any parameter of the image, setting up the quality of the image, it's all done with that one control. And switching between the different controls that you want to adjust is not trivial. You press and hold a button in order to put it in a mode where you choose which parameter you want to control, and then you hit a button to select it, and then you can make adjustments. So it's not a fast process. If your image is blown out and you're manually focusing, switching from manual focus over to controlling the iris, it takes, even if you're good, it's going to take about 10 seconds, and so you can't do instant responses to changing conditions. When I use this camera, I actually set the zoom control to be the gain, and I use autofocus. Autofocus on it, it's fine. Not amazing, but it's fine. And I just use the zoom to control iris, control the gain at that point. So normally when I'm using this camera, I actually use it with a wireless system. So I don't have any cables that I'm dealing with. I'll do another review, a future video about that wireless system, especially after the manufacturers had a chance to address an issue that I discovered with it. But yeah, if you've got a camera that's moving around, shoulder mount's really the way to go. And the Ursa Mini obviously can be shoulder mount. This is the shoulder mount configuration here. And there's a bar to extend the location of the handle out to where it's a little more convenient. But that camera's very heavy when fully rigged, and the placement of the handle is just awkward. You can move it around, but it's just awkward, and so it doesn't make a very good shoulder mount live studio event camera. All right, so there you go. Those are the cameras that I use most frequently when I'm doing video production, well, especially the live video production. Just going from right to left, the Blackmagic Ursa Mini. This is the 4K EF version. EF mount uses Canon style lenses. The base camera itself is $3,000. However, by the time you add batteries, battery charger, viewfinder, lenses, shoulder mount kit, anything else, tripod, whatever else, you're looking at quite a bit of money. I've got about $12,000 in this camera, so not a good choice if budget is your primary concern, especially considering the trade-offs that you have to make with this camera in a live environment. So probably not one that I would recommend for people that are trying to start a video production business and do so on a budget. Next we have the Sony PXW-Z150. This camera is about $3,200 street price. Extremely highly recommended. However, if you want to save a little money, you can get the PXW-X70, which is, it's not identical internally, but it's extremely similar internally. It still uses a 1-inch sensor, 20 megapixel on both, produces a stunning image. You give up a few things, but overall, it's a good compromise if you need to save some money and still get a very good quality image. And it even has SDI on it, so great camera there too. And that one's about $2,000 without the 4K firmware upgrade. If you want the 4K capabilities, then you'd pay another between $250 and $500 in order to upgrade the firmware on that one to do 4K. 4K on this one comes straight out of the box. The Blackmagic Design Micro Studio camera, street price is about $1,200, but of course you're adding lenses onto that. It doesn't include a lens or have a built-in lens. I don't like the camera that much, and so I'm not going to give it a recommendation. It has its uses, but they're very specialized. So next we have this little guy, and I do not know the manufacturer on that one, but again, Amazon about 90 bucks. Link below. Sony SRG 300 SE pan-tilt zoom. That camera is about $3,700. It's about as cheap as you can get pan-tilt zoom high def that's usable for live production. All the rest of them have significant shortcomings that make them impractical, if not downright unusable in a live environment. This one, older model, no longer available, but if you can pick one up on eBay for under $1,000. It actually still makes a fairly good live camera. It's HDV tape based, and tape based cameras have fallen out of favor, and so they don't go for a lot of money. But for live video production, you don't care because you're generally not recording on the camera anyway. So yeah, you can pick this up under $1,000. HVR V1U, and there are some similar newer models that are available for a little bit more, but acceptable image quality, I'll say it that way. And then lastly, the Sony HXR MC2500. Image quality on it's fine, mostly usability issues. Street price on that's about $1,300, so it's considerably cheaper than, say, one of these. And because it's a Sony, they have similar imaging science behind the way they process the video, so that this camera looks very good next to this camera. You can switch between them without noticeable shifts in color or lighting exposure. So yeah, so that's about it. I do appreciate you watching. Any views on the videos are very helpful. And if you're going to buy any of this stuff, I'd really appreciate it if you use the links in the description. These are affiliate links and allow me to get a few pennies on the dollar for every purchase that you make. The only reason I'm able to do this channel is because I'm purchasing this equipment outright, and I can give you an honest review. And so if you can help out by purchasing through the links below, that's extremely helpful, and it makes my job a little bit easier. Also be sure to like and subscribe on the video, very helpful as well. And try and produce videos about once a week, although sometimes I do get a little bit busy with work and have to delay those a little bit. And if you have any questions, be sure and comment below. I do try to answer those every time they come in as soon as I can. So anyway, I do appreciate your watching, and thanks, and have a great day.